Hello and welcome to another video on endocrine physiology. In this video, we're going to talk about the regulation of hormone secretion and hormone receptors. Sometimes our bodies need more or less of certain hormones, and that's why we have different mechanisms of regulating them. Now, there are two principal ways of hormone regulation. It can be done either by neural or feedback mechanisms. Neural mechanism simply means that neurons stimulate endocrine glands to secrete a hormone. This is true, for example, for norepinephrine or epinephrine, as they are released when the nervous system stimulates the adrenal medulla. However, it is not that common as feedback mechanisms, which we are going to look at now. Feedback regulation can be either positive or negative. We'll start with negative feedback first because it's more common. The basic principle is very simple. When there's a high concentration of a certain hormone, its further secretion is inhibited. Or more generally, after a hormone is secreted, its effect inhibits its further secretion. That's why it's called negative feedback. Because instead of further secreting more and more hormone, we do the exact opposite, inhibiting the secretion. The reason we have negative feedback is that we don't want to secrete too much of a hormone. But it can also work the other way around. When there's just too little of the hormone, its further secretion is stimulated. A classic example is insulin. You know that insulin regulates the concentration of glucose in the blood. When there's a high glucose concentration, insulin secretion is stimulated. This lowers the glucose concentration, and we don't need that much insulin anymore. So instead of further stimulating its secretion, we do the opposite, inhibit it because it's no longer needed. Positive feedback works the other way around. A high concentration of a certain hormone stimulates its further secretion. Or again, more generally, the effect of a hormone stimulates its further secretion. Although this type of feedback is not very common in our bodies, we can talk about oxytocin, which is again a classic example, so you can fully understand how it works. Oxytocin stimulates contractions during labor. As the contractions increase, even more and more oxytocin is secreted until the baby is delivered. With the example of insulin, we had a problem that there was too much glucose. We secreted insulin, glucose concentration decreased, and this inhibited further secretion of the hormone. Here, oxytocin stimulates contraction, and this causes further secretion of the hormone, so more and more oxytocin is released. So we're not doing the exact opposite, but rather amplifying the effect. This is the positive feedback. Great. However, there are two more mechanisms that are important and that we need to understand: downregulation and upregulation. To understand it, imagine that we have a hormone and we send it to its target tissue, to its target location, in other words. Now, in order for it to work, there must be specific receptors in the tissue. And as you can probably guess, the more receptors there are, the greater the response of the tissue to the hormone. The second important factor is that there's the so-called affinity of a receptor for the hormone. Affinity simply tells us how strongly a certain substance binds to another. So in this case, how strongly the hormone binds to a receptor. Again, the higher the affinity, the stronger the hormone binds to the receptor, the better the effect, the response. And up and down regulation is basically just changing these two factors, number of receptors and their affinity for the hormone. In downregulation, there's less receptors, or their affinity for the hormone is not that strong. And in upregulation, there's more receptors and their affinity is stronger. Downregulation can, for example, happen by inactivating receptors or decreasing their synthesis. This mechanism is used, for example, when you have a very high level of a certain hormone and you need to lessen its effect. Then you lower the number of its receptors, and by doing so, it loses some of its effect. Upregulation, on the other hand, happens by doing the exact opposite, synthesizing more and more receptors or activating them. For example, there's an upregulation of oxytocin receptors during pregnancy, and we already understand why. Because oxytocin will stimulate contractions, and to reach its maximum effect, we need as many receptors as possible. Okay? Great. So this is it for the regulation of hormones. I hope this video helped you to understand how the mechanisms of regulation work and that you found it useful. For more videos on physiology or medicine in general, please subscribe. Thank you again, and until next time, don't forget that medicine can be easy.